If there's one crime for which justice completely fails, what do you think it is? It is sexual violence. And sexual violence is a widespread crime. Here in Switzerland, 1 out of 5 women has suffered sexual violence. And in many countries that are at peace, that number is actually higher. And out of 100 victims, only 2 ever see the perpetrator convicted. Just 2%. In the areas where I work, in conflict zones, where sexual violence is used as a weapon of war, we see even less convictions. But whether it is in peace or whether it is in war, perpetrators get away with impunity, while the survivors face trauma, and sometimes their lives are completely shattered. So what can be done for survivors to at least have a sense of justice and to recover from that trauma? The framework that I would like to share with you today is about reparation. I believe that every survivor in peace and in war should receive reparation as a form of healing and as a form of justice. Right now they don't, but I think if we think outside the box, they can. Reparation can take different forms. It could start with psychological care and medical care. It could also include a financial compensation to cover for the harm that's been done. But reparation can also take more symbolic forms, such as an apology at the hands of the state, for example. Or it could be a monument that is dedicated to victims. Now, who taught me what reparation is really about? Let me show you. These are some of the boldest, bravest women I've ever met. They're from different places, they have different religions, they have different ages, but there's also a lot that they share. And that is their strength, their beauty, their activism. But they also have something else in common, and that is their pain. Many of these women have faced the most vicious forms of sexual violence. Sometimes they were still a child when it happened. Very often, there were multiple perpetrators. Sometimes their family was forced to watch their children, their husbands. We don't often talk about that brutal detail, but I do really think it's important to understand the profound harm that is caused. A few years ago, we came together for the second time, and we were sitting in a room talking about what they need, about what they really need, reparation, and what reparation could look like. And there was one of the women who explained it to me in this way. She took a cloth, and she showed it to us. She said, "Look, beautiful, strong. That's what humans are naturally." And then she took another cloth. And she said, "This is what happens when sexual violence is used as a weapon of war." But then she took this one, and she said, "This is after reparation, scarred but strong." So what are those tears? What are the tears in this cloth? Well, survivors of sexual violence in war are harmed at so many different levels. Starting with the physical, they face severe medical issues such as sexually transmitted diseases, broken bones, genital mutilation, because the violence is so brutal. And then there's the emotional level. The psychological scarring is really deep, and it can stay for a long time. The grief, the fear, the nightmares that can stay for life. There's also the social level. Survivors of sexual violence in conflict are often excluded from their communities. Now, that exclusion takes different shapes in different contexts. But in my 25 years working with survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, in every region around the world, they do describe very similar feelings of feeling isolated and being shamed. Just recently, I was in Nigeria, and I met a young woman. I'm going to call her Simona to protect her confidentiality. And Simona was only 15 years old when Boko Haram overran her village, and they captured her and her schoolmates from the school. And Simona spent 3 long years in captivity. She was subjected to all forms of violence, including sexual violence. But fortunately, she managed to escape, and after a long, dangerous journey, she found her village. But you know what? She was not welcomed by open arms. She was rejected by her family community, by her family members. She was spat upon, and people saw her as tainted by the enemy. Despite her mother trying to support her, she ended up begging for food. Now, people like Simona, all survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, whether women or men, they have the right to reparation. There are a few forms of reparation that survivors tend to prioritize. The first one is rehabilitation and compensation. These can take really tangible, practical forms. For example, a lifelong free health insurance or long-lasting psychological care. It could also be a financial stipend, compensation, or perhaps support in picking up your profession if you've lost your job and your income as a result. And there's a woman from the Democratic Republic of Congo who explained the importance of this to me as follows. She said, if you've been raped in front of your children, if you're too afraid to go outside, if you can't work because your body is in pieces, and if your own husband can't look you into the eye, you lose everything you have. You lose you. The tower that was you tumbles down. And for her, rehabilitation was building back that tower, block by block. The other form of reparation that survivors prioritize is acknowledgement, particularly for sexual violence, which is the only crime in the world for which victims tend to be blamed. Recognizing their experience for what it is extremely important. It's a crime. Survivors need to be acknowledged that harm has been done to them, that it should not have happened, and that they are not to blame. Okay, who can provide reparation? Well, theoretically, there's 2 pathways, through courts and through the state. Through courts. Again, theoretically, every perpetrator should be held accountable at a court and could be made to pay compensation to the victim. However, we have seen how, for example, here in Switzerland or any other country at peace, how difficult it is for survivors to actually access justice. Now, what you can imagine is that in a wartime, in a war zone, courts are hardly functioning. But what is more, for survivors to identify the perpetrator, which is needed to go to court, is really difficult. Very often they've been raped by multiple perpetrators, or the perpetrators were all wearing the same uniform, or he was wearing a mask, or the sexual violence took place in a dark prison cell. But what is more, perpetrators are often at large. So then the state. Governments have a responsibility to set up reparation programs for all victims of human rights violations. That's an obligation. With this, victims could get reparation without having to go to court, without identifying their perpetrator, and that's good, because these programs can potentially reach really large numbers of victims. However, there's just one thing, and that is around the world, I can count reparation programs that are inclusive of survivors of sexual violence on just one hand. And what is more, they're often set up decades after the crimes were committed. And that is not when survivors need it most. No, they don't have that luxury to wait. So, the bold women that I introduced you to came together and started thinking, who else can provide rehabilitation and compensation and acknowledgement? Could it be the people around us? Could it be community members? Could it be NGOs? And an idea emerged, and they started thinking, why don't we lobby our governments to take that responsibility to set up reparation programs, but at the same time look at other means to provide livelihood, education, compensation, all those building blocks to survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. And there was a woman who raised her hand. She was from Syria, and she had been raped in one of the regime prisons. Now, she had no prospect of her government ever paying reparation in any time soon. And she said, why don't we create our own fund for survivors? And others came in and said, yes, where we can also acknowledge victims by organizing community dialogues and by setting up memorials and gardens and arts projects. And that is how, a few years ago, the Global Survivors Fund was born. It was founded by Dr. Denis Mukwege and Ms. Nadia Murad, who had received the Nobel Peace Prize for their fight against sexual violence used as a weapon of war. Now, in our work, what we see, for reparation to succeed, it needs to be designed with those affected. I don't believe in participation. I believe in co-creation. Survivors themselves have the solutions. They are that seed of change. So we don't give them a voice. No, they have a voice. You just need to start listening to it. And if there's one thing that they have really said and insisted on since the beginning, is reparation should not wait until a conflict is over. And that is unlike traditional thinking. No, they're saying for it to be effective, it needs to come early. And that could even be when a war is still going on. Right now, in Ukraine, the government, civil society, and survivors are working together to provide compensation to victims of sexual violence and other forms of reparations as well, while the conflict is ongoing, so that they can already start rebuilding everything that was destroyed, block by block. So what's becoming clear to me? Repair is possible. Sure, many victims will never feel like they have returned to the person that they were before, but they feel human again. When sexual violence is used as a weapon, it dehumanizes, and reparation rehumanizes. Coming back to Simona, the young woman in Nigeria, last time we spoke, she said, "I'm above it all." And I was taken aback. How could that be? Well, she explained she was involved in designing a project with reparation measures for herself and for others, supported by NGOs in her community. It was about education and livelihoods. She herself was going back to school and she was making an income. Others that spat on her before now came to her asking for help. And she said, I feel acknowledged. I feel acknowledged for what's been done to me and to others. Now, that's not quite a full justice circle yet, because her captors are still at large. But Simona's flourishing, from a victim to a survivor to a driver of change. Now, what can we learn from Simona and from all of these other bold, brave women who think outside the box? And not just in war zones, but also in countries where there's peace. Well, as we've seen, in countries where there's peace, sexual violence is widespread, like in war. And the trauma is profound and it's long-lasting, like in war. Survivors' experiences are being questioned and they don't have access to justice, like in war. They don't get acknowledgement. So I encourage you to think outside of the box, inspired by these women. Could you imagine a reparation program in a country at peace for all survivors of sexual violence? Perhaps a national body for healing and acknowledgement where survivors can go to be officially recognized outside of court, where they can be supported and compensated for the harm that's been done to them. Think about it. But in the meantime, you too can help repair. You can provide acknowledgement. If ever a survivor of sexual violence shares their story with you, show them that you hear them, that they are not alone. Tell them harm has been done to you, but you are not to blame. And remembering this cloth, scarred but strong, repair is possible. Thank you.